Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and this week for Wednesday, February 16th, 2022, we're going to be answering the following three questions we've been hearing from international educators this past week. First up, what is the future of international student mobility globally? Second, are you listening to your international students' experiences during this pandemic? And third, what do Saudi students want these days? We'll be taking a look at these three questions and more on today's SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. Thanks everybody for joining us. As we do each week, we take our three questions that we ask during the roundup from our newsletter that comes out on Monday mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern. If you'd like a free copy of that in your inbox, please go to smieconsulting.org/subscribe. Enter your details after hitting the subscribe button, and we'll get you that newsletter fresh each Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. We take those themes from the news stories that we see develop during the week, and we answer those larger questions here on the Roundup to kind of give a fresh perspective, including some more in-depth analysis on what these topics might mean for us in international education. So we'll get started today, as we do each week, with the first question. What is the future of international student mobility globally? Now, for those who have been in the business of international education for a while, you know that at some point, probably back in the 90s, America, the United States of America, had about just under a third of the total internationally mobile students studying in the United States. So at that time, the UK, Australia were our biggest competitors, and those were by far the two closest to us. Since that time, through the post 9/11 collapse of student flows from certain parts of the world, from the 2008 financial crisis that impacted the world as well, to what we've experienced in the last 2 years with the global pandemic for COVID-19. We've seen ebbs and flows in student mobility. But one thing has remained constant, is that the amount of students studying outside their home countries has grown significantly. The current data suggests that there are approximately 5 million students currently studying outside their home countries at this point in time. Back in the early 2000s, or just around 9/11, it was about 2.7 million. So the numbers have continually increased and doubled over the last 20 years, more than doubled over the last 20 years. So we're seeing now kind of a look forward into the next 10 years, or 10 years or so, to see what future trends might be looking like for international student mobility. And one thing I've always said, when I brought up the example back in the 90s when the U.S. share of the global mobility pie was about a third, a little less than a third, probably around 29-30%. There was a concern voiced back then that our competitors, the UK and Australia, were getting better at their game and they were becoming more proactive. We saw Australia, who had begun using agents in the late 80s, that trend had accelerated. They've become more proactive in expanding their reach beyond Southeast Asia, South and East Asia. You saw the UK getting more sophisticated in its recruitment, whereas the US kind of was staying kind of consistent and living off its reputation, if you will. You saw certainly a number of institutions who had been recruiting internationally for some time, where they'd be physically going overseas, had developed strong connections with schools, counselors, start to look at using agents to expand their footprint, to have in-country representatives in places that they couldn't always get to. We saw the rise of Education USA in the mid-noughties and early teens, and how significant that became in U.S. institutions' outreach to students overseas. We saw the rise of study consortia. So there have been reactions to our competition are getting more engaged globally. What's really driving this question today is what I've seen over the last 28 years in my professional career in international education, is that yes, the U.S. share of the globally mobile students has reduced over the years. We're probably at 21% right now, as opposed to 30% over the last nearly 30 years of time that have expanded. But our numbers, with the exception of the COVID years, which have significantly put a dent in our overall numbers, have gone up significantly, more than doubled in that time as well. So we see that, yes, our share of the overall pie has gotten smaller, but our sheer number of students studying in the United States from overseas has expanded dramatically as well. And the future in terms of where we're going from here in the next few years, this question is really motivated by an article that came out in the Pie this past week from a group called Holon, and that's an interesting group I'd not heard before. It's a group called Holon IQ. They carried out a global estimate of the market in bigger level detail than ever seen before, looking towards the next 10 years on a complete scale. And they are suggesting that by 2030, so in the next 8 years, the number of students studying outside their home countries is going to expand from 5 million, where we are about now, to 8 million. So that's a significant increase. That's a 60% increase in students that will be studying outside their home countries in the next 8 years. And that means that pie is continuing to grow. The international student mobility pie is getting larger, as it has been for the last 30 years more, and continues to grow since the 40s, when records started being kept with IIE Open Doors. So we can see that over the last 50 years, we've seen dramatic growth. We've seen slowdowns, we've seen accelerations, but in terms of the global mobility of international students, you've seen them starting to expand, maybe not as far-flung destinations as the U.S., Canada, Australia, U.K., and New Zealand, but they are looking at options outside their home countries in more perhaps regional hubs. And regional hubs have been predicted for a number of years, that places like Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia have been talked about as becoming regional hubs for universities, for student interest to study outside their home countries. We've seen other countries like China significantly ramp up their higher ed capacity, not only for accepting their own students, but accepting specifically international students into their institutions. That has happened, and China has risen up the ranks and wasn't even on the radar 20 years ago as a top 20 destination for international students, is now in the top 5. They were threatening the UK for a while until COVID hit, and their numbers have plummeted, and their reputation has been damaged in the long term, because they've refused to let students back in. Until very recently, there's been whispers of that beginning to happen. But we're seeing some real challenges that to if you will, the hegemony of the top 3, the US, UK, and Australia. You've seen Canada enter the mix. You've seen China enter the mix. You've seen other European destinations, France and in particular Germany, getting much more popular because of their lower tuition rates for international students. So we've seen a lot of countries realize, we need to be getting our acts together. You've seen India over the last year or two really put their foot forward, and it may take a little bit longer for them to develop, because there's a lot more disorganization within India than perhaps in other countries like China or the UK. But you see other major nations who have traditionally been top senders of students abroad now looking at the results of what other countries have been able to do in attracting students, and now we're seeing value in promoting their own countries as destinations for international students and having specific scholarships available. So there's a lot that's changed in terms of the pie, because the number of competitors for those students has grown dramatically. And in addition to the hegemony of the top 3, I mentioned US, UK, and Australia, Canada has significantly grown and has put themselves forward as probably one of the most welcoming destinations for any immigrant, student or potential worker, future citizen, or permanent resident. So you see this report by Holon IQ looks at some of the longer term trends and really shows that the demand coming out of Asia, Africa, and Latin America over the next 30 years is really going to underpin their view that there's a strong outlook ahead for continued growth. They even put a dollar amount on it, and they're saying right now the current amount of funding that is predicted to grow. We're looking at a growth from right around $200 billion pre-pandemic US dollars in terms of the total value of the international student mobility pie to $433 billion by the end of this decade, by 2030. So that there are going to be variations, obviously, depending on the length of the program, the credential, and the destination market. But certainly you see the number of competitors coming into the game for trying to reach those international students has grown significantly over the last decade. And you see right now they're saying 70% of global demand for higher education outside home countries is in Asia and Africa. And over half of the top 200 universities, 55% of the top 200 to 500 universities are in the US, UK, Canada, or Australia. So that shows you where students want to go, to the top schools in the top 500. Over half of those are going to be in the US, UK, and Canada, and Australia. So we see that the capacity, and one of the reasons they're going to look outside of Asia and Africa, those students in those regions for study, is because of capacity outside of potentially China, maybe India, if they get their act together. The capacity in those countries to continue to host students is limited. They haven't gone through a rapid expansion of their higher ed capacity in their institutions as China has recently. You see in the U.S. has, as a percentage of its total higher ed enrollment, we're talking about less than 5%. Right now are international students. So there's tremendous capacity to grow in the United States, international student populations. Whereas in the UK, they're already running 25 to 30%. Australia are running 30 to 35%. So Canada, similarly, are in the 20, 25% range. So there's really a threshold past which institutions in the top reaches of top destinations won't be able to assume many more students unless they expand their higher ed capacity, just because of public pushback. Who are you as institutions? Are you here to educate our own students first, or are you here to educate overseas students first and bring in the money that they have, and how it gets pictured in the news and politically? There are very real threats to continued growth at some of the top schools that are already 25, 30, 40% international. Certainly some Canadian colleges and universities are running up against that. Certainly some that see dollar signs first and don't care about mix of students and diversity and balance and services provided. They've run out of money. They've gone bust. And they have been closed. They've been prohibited to enroll future international students. Some Quebec colleges owned by the same group are now closing down because they were really going through some fraudulent recruitment practices. So we see some real challenges to huge growth in certain schools and colleges in the top markets. But there are certainly in some countries a lot of institutions that don't have significant international populations that, if they start early enough and plan effectively, can significantly grow their populations and do so without damaging their overall reputations. And you see a lot of institutions now, particularly in the U.S., that's obviously the market I know best, that are beginning to show an eagerness to explore. There are a number of contributing factors to this. We talked about last week the demographic cliff that we're about to go off in the U.S. in the next 3 years. That with a drop in domestic high school graduates in the United States, that there will be a need to look for other sources of students to fill that need, fill that gap. And international students are going to be one of the key target areas for growth. And we'll see how institutions, if they're smart and starting early enough, can put in place the foundations to really attract the right kinds of students and have the services on campus to make those students feel a part of campus life and feel like they're going to be successful on your institutional campuses. So the future is certainly bright for international education. There will be continued growth in markets that the U.S. has traditionally done well in, but there will be increased competition, and that's just a fact of life in international education these days. And the more you're aware of who your competition are around the world, the better prepared you are to answer the kind of concerns for students that will be considering not just your country and your institution, but colleges and universities in multiple countries and multiple destinations that you might not have thought of. So how aware are you of what's going on around you is going to be an important component in your overall success moving forward. And certainly that's something we help institutions with here at SMIE Consulting, and happy to talk with any of you who have some concerns or needs in that area. But that's enough for question one. Let's move on to question two. Are you listening to your international students' experiences? And this is a topic that we've covered in the past in different ways of looking at it. But this way we're talking about this today is in light of the pandemic. It's always good to know and certainly have focus groups with students that are graduating, have new student orientation interviews with students when they still have that excitement of just having arrived and going through orientation and being overwhelmed, but just really excited about everything, to capture that and see how those two different groups from those students that have gone through the process and are about to graduate and go on into the wider world, how they feel about their experiences, and then on the front end, how your students you just recruited feel about the institutions and where perhaps there are some disconnects. And certainly from your recent or your soon-to-be graduates, certainly this has been the last couple of years have just been the most bizarre for most international educators in terms of their workloads, in terms of their work-life home balances, in terms of where they do what they do, and how the kinds of issues that have come up have been unprecedented in the last couple of years. And the schools that have come out of it well are ones that have been responsive to student needs. And if your current international students have there's been some poor experiences or bad incidents that have happened on campus. Maybe there's been some hate crimes or whatever against some of your East Asian students. Whatever the case may be, have you been responsive? How did you respond as an institution to those concerns or to the issues that these students had? Because that really will determine your long-term success. So the responsiveness to international student experiences is nothing new, but in particular, I'm talking here about responsiveness to the situation where over the last 2 years, you've had students that perhaps haven't been able to get home at all, that might have been under normal circumstances, been able to travel home for a summer or winter break, that have not been able to do so because of the pandemic. Larger factors and forces involved in travel and safety and health concerns than we've ever experienced in the U.S. in the last 50 years. So this question is really getting at your students during the pandemic have undergone some significant shifts in their lives, may have lost loved ones to the pandemic, may have not been able to travel for 2+ years to their home countries, may have been stuck outside the United States for the last 2 years trying to get back in, but haven't been able to get visas, that may have been studying online and taking their classes synchronously with when you're offering them if you don't have an asynchronous option. But they now want to come back, and that kind of perseverance needs to be rewarded. But have you been responsive to those students? Have you been able to meet their needs when they have occurred? All those kinds of issues that have popped up have really impacted students' mental health, and that's clear more than anything else, not just international students, but domestic students as well. The kind of experiences they've had in certain parts of the U.S. when they might have been disconnected. Domestic students might have been disconnected from their normal friend set because they haven't been able to meet them in person because of lockdown restrictions and all that for periods of time. Just multiply that by 10 when you think about your international students. The kind of mental strain that they've been under, not just to do well in school and maintain satisfactory progress towards graduation, but the disconnect that they've been having from family that they might normally have been able to have, that to disconnect from normal life, from the opportunities to get out more, and that have been significantly limited. So you see article after article, and I'll be putting links to 3 of them. One from intl that shows a Chinese student's journey through the pandemic when she was initially left the United States to go back to China at the end of her degree, right as the pandemic was coming to was ramping up, and then her experience is now looking to come back to do a doctoral program, and what's some of the factors she's considering in where she's going to go. You also see some other campuses, other issues that are reflected where what you see in terms of the support that's supporting international students is should be even more of a priority now during the pandemic because of what's happened with the numbers, and we all know the Open Doors numbers certainly reflected dramatic drops in the last 2 years, but the need going back to mental health again, the need for support. And this is, I think, in this day and age, certainly 25 years ago, we didn't talk about, and a lot of cultures, even in the U.S., we started to hear talk. It was becoming more acceptable to go seek help as a student. If you weren't doing well in classes, you could get help for something that you might be struggling with. This is when diagnoses of ADHD and other learning disabilities were coming to the fore. IEPs were becoming not intensive English programs, but individualized education programs were being designed and acceptable in colleges and as proof of disability when you were applying for university entry. So, but for international students, culturally, in many countries around the world, talking about mental health issues isn't done, and so there are still some countries today where that's not really talked about in public. But the reality of this pandemic is certainly reflected in the United States, but certainly in other countries as well. Hey, there's been some very real struggles that have damaged emotional health, mental health of our students, and how do we respond? And it's not just students, it's healthcare workers, it's frontline workers, that anyone that's lost a loved one during the pandemic has had these kind of struggles. But it's maybe more acceptable to talk about these, about mental health issues and concerns and feelings and all of these things. And certainly on campus, there's never been a time more important than now to make sure that students are aware of what those services are. All campuses have counseling centers, have mental health professionals that could help students with concerns, and some have even been thinking about this internationally to make it a more palatable for them even before the pandemic by combining healthcare, regular healthcare services, health center on campus, and the counseling center in the same facility, so that those issues can be addressed when they happen, rather than if it's connected to a physical ailment. Those things are often related. So we talk about these things in the U.S. Often to our domestic students, but for our international students, it can often be a harder conversation. So is your campus really equipped to handle this? And this is something that I think this University World News article, certainly that I'm posting a link to, as I do all the links in the comments section for this Facebook Live event on the Facebook page for SMIE Consulting. Then this is something that institutions that have learned this lesson and have the services available certainly are in a much better position to create that sense of belonging on campus, to create a sense of, hey, these resources are here for you, and they can help you maintain your own mental health and can keep you on the right path toward graduation and engaging you in a very clear and accessible way. Which is, again, what in years past, these things might not have been talked about openly amongst international students, certainly by the parents, maybe not. But now the realization is, hey, everybody's been impacted by this, and my son or daughter is studying overseas and needs some help, needs to talk through some issues. I want them to get the support they need, and that's something that I think parents realize too. That their worldviews have kind of been shaped a little bit by what's been going on with the pandemic, and that's another article I'll share from California, from the Claremont colleges, their student paper for the 5 Claremont colleges, that an international student shares her perspective that because of COVID-19 travel restrictions and inability to travel and meet and see family, that's impacting mental health of students, and that needs to be recognized by institutions and supported as much as possible. So there's increasing evidence that these issues of mental health need to be addressed, and the only way you know that is if you're listening to what your current students are saying. So hopefully that hits home this week more than most in terms of what a focus needs to be for your ISSS offices, for your senior international officer that can lead a charge if it hasn't already been done to make sure international students are aware and have access to and feel a sense of normalcy about this, that this is something that, hey, we know everybody struggled with the pandemic, and we want you to know that we hear you, that you haven't been able to travel as much as you like. You've had issues with access and to facilities and that type of thing, classes being online, and that impacts your mental well-being. So let's hope that situation gets addressed on more campuses in the coming weeks and months. Last question of the day. What do Saudi students want these days? We've gone through a fairly quiet period with relationships with the kingdom over the last probably 7 years, when the King Abdullah Scholarship Program was very much restructured and minimized in terms of the volume of students that were coming to the United States to study abroad and other countries as well on full scholarships. That program has significantly narrowed and has been replaced in a lot of ways by much more targeted and focused programs that are still government scholarship programs. They're called the Path to Excellence scholarships. And if there's a few other smaller niche scholarships that are for particular industries that Saudi Arabia is looking to develop in tourism, in space exploration, in mining and other hospitality industries that have really been ramping up in terms of needs that the kingdom has. So we're seeing the Path to Excellence scholarships and others like it are much more focused, smaller numbers. Instead of tens of thousands of students coming, there are now 500 here, 75 here, 100 here. That may give opportunities for institutions that are looking to still attract Saudi-sponsored students in a more targeted way. This will be an opportunity to really understand that, hey, yeah, though the volume isn't going to be as strong, you can still get a piece of this Saudi Arabian funded scholarship student pool. There are some really interesting demographic information in Saudi Arabia. They have a huge youth population. The total population of the country is about 35 million. There are more than 5 million right now, 15 to 24-year-olds that are preparing for higher education. They don't all have dreams of studying in Saudi Arabia, and they might do that for their undergrad and then look to go overseas for a graduate degree. Some might be very willing to come right away. But you also see some interesting trends beginning to pop up in Saudi Arabia, that there are more self-funded students that are looking to study abroad. What is important that though these particular Path to Excellence scholarships that that they already have their English proficiency and they're ready to go without any further language or foundation study. That had been one of the hallmarks of the King Abdullah Scholarship Program. Most all of these students were coming in needing a year of English, if not more, before they could start their academic program. So that was a boon for English language programs, maybe not so much anymore. But these smaller Path to Excellence scholarships that are focused on particular industries in health sciences, tourism, hospitality, as we mentioned, those are requiring those students to already have English language ability. So there's more of that happening in country. So being on the list is still a thing in Saudi Arabia, that you really do have to have any hope of getting these sponsored kids. But even now, there's an increasing rise of self-funded students. They still cannot study at institutions, even though they might be paying their own way. They can study wherever they want, but if they want to come back and work in Saudi Arabia, they have to have a job. They have to have a degree from an institution that is on one of these approved lists. So that is still a thing, and working those relationships with the cultural missions in D.C. and or in Northern Virginia for Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other nations that have sponsored student lists of where they can go, where those students can go, is important. And as we're seeing now for this group, a rising group of self-funded students from Saudi Arabia, they too need to have degrees from institutions, so they can't just go wherever they want. They need to pick schools that are still recognized on the Saudi list, on the second list here in the U.S. So that's what we have for you today. Just understanding changes, subtle changes in markets can often, if you're not prepared, can lead to missed opportunities. But this is something that as countries evolve, as funding dries up in one area, it leads to other opportunities in others. So we're seeing some changes in Saudi that may give some reason for optimism for future recruitment efforts from that nation. So we'll talk more about these questions and more in the coming weeks and months, to be sure. But for now, that's all we have from the Midweek Roundup, and we look forward to chatting with you in the weeks to come. Cheers.